I had given a paper down at Louisiana State University, a symposium on time, and I was an invited speaker. I had spoken on the topic as I'm speaking here tonight, presenting the scientific evidence for creation. And geochronologists had written in the paper that my article was published in, or I should say a summary of the talk of my presentation at the Louisiana State Conference on Time was published in Geotimes in 1978, also published in the Transactions of the AGU in January 1979. A geochronologist responded, and he said, if what I'm saying is true, this calls into question the entire science, modern science, of geochronology. In other words, if there are truly primordial polonium halos in granites, there's only one way that happened, and that is the instantaneous crystallization of the granites, or the biotite, or the rocks, the basement crystalline rocks of our Earth. He realized that, and he said, if that's true, it calls into question the entire science, modern science of geochronology. Well, of course, he said, and went on to say, he didn't think it was true, that there must be another explanation. Well, I thought about his comments, and they were very cordial. I thought, this is going to go on forever. There's got to be a way to settle this matter scientifically. And it occurred to me that the evolutionary view of the origin of this rock was that it cooled down over a long period of time on the basis of what we call the uniformitarian principle. Now, the uniformitarian principle is simply the idea or the assumption that the physical laws that we now observe in the universe have been sufficient to govern everything down to the present time. In other words, nothing has ever happened except as they have happened in accord with physical laws that we now understand. Well, now, the implication of that is that this granite may have formed a couple of billion years ago, or this biotite crystal may have formed a billion or so years ago, but when it did form, according to evolution, it had to form according to the very same laws that we have today. So I proposed a test. I said, all right, take this piece of granite. It's a falsification test. I say this rock is created. I say the piece of biotite was created. But I go further than that and say, I don't think that you're going to be able to synthesize or duplicate a piece of granite today in the laboratory. In fact, I said, I will consider my work falsified if you can take a rock like this granite, melt it, heat it up, and let it cool. If you can come back with something like this granite, I'll say that I'm wrong. I'm no longer going to say anything about this being a created rock. And furthermore, if these polonium halos could then be synthesized or produced within that piece of synthesized granite, I would withdraw the claim that I found evidence for creation. Well, that was in 1979. And I didn't know whether anyone was going to synthesize a piece of granite the next week or the next month. 1979 came and went. 1980, another geologist wrote a letter to the Transactions of the AGU. He criticized my work, and I wasn't at that time even aware that he was going to write the article. It took me a whole year to get a response published, and the details of that are again in the book. But still, nothing from the scientific community relating to the falsification test. In other words, I'd put everything on the line. If evolution is really true, if the fundamental premise of the evolutionary theory is the uniformitarian principle, the glue that holds it together is the uniformitarian principle. If indeed there is something in the earth today that came as a result of creation, the uniformitarian principle is wrong. That means everything stretching from the Big Bang down to the time that we are here today. Everything stretching from the Big Bang down to the time that we're here tonight cannot be governed or is not governed by the uniformitarian principle. That means every interpretation of radioactive dating, which means the fossil record included in that, every fossil that is dated in conjunction with rocks, which depends upon a constant decay rate, and every one of them does, can no longer be relied upon as scientific evidence for evolution. In other words, the whole scenario disintegrates if you don't have that one uniformitarian assumption. And I put it all on the line. I said, go ahead and duplicate the synthesis of a piece of granite or a piece of biotite. If you can do that, then you will have justified, you will have verified that indeed the uniformitarian principle, the fundamental principle of evolution, is valid. 1979 came and went. 1980 came and went. 1981. Here I was, October 27, 1981. and they were asking me to go to the Arkansas creation trial to testify about the evidences I'd found. Well, I'd been watching the news and listening to the reports of what was happening, and as I said, I was very much inclined just to leave the whole matter alone. But there were people who were evolutionists who knew of my work, and they kept saying there was no evidence for creation. And they well knew what I had published in the open literature. And very few people, relatively speaking, in the public ever knew about my reports until the present time, or as you are tonight, hearing about it. In other words, it was something that was confined almost exclusively to the scientific literature, but these scientists kept saying there was no evidence for creation science. Well, as you remember, years and years earlier, I started the search for the answer because I wanted to know the truth. And I thought about it. And it occurred to me that at the Arkansas creation trial, the world's best evolutionists were going to be on deck. My work would be scrutinized more closely than it had ever been scrutinized before, even though it had gone through the scientific literature and through referee reports. It was going to be re-scrutinized, and I wanted to go to find out, indeed, if there was truth in what I was saying. I thought it was important for me to know, and it's important for other people to know, whether indeed there is valid scientific evidence for creation. So I decided to go, and I went. Well, it was an interesting trial. In fact, my wife and I both were there. And the details of the trial are in the book. The American Civil Liberties Union was there when I took a deposition down in Atlanta. My deposition lasted about 7 hours. It was very interesting. I detailed everything I'm telling you tonight, except in much greater detail about the evidences for creation. This deposition, of course, was used, to examine me at the trial, or cross-examine me at the trial after I gave my testimony. But at the trial, the American Civil Liberties Union brought in the very best in radiometric dating, in subjects concerning the origin of life, and the details of their testimony are all in the book. And I might add that at the Arkansas creation trial, one of the things that I thought had been done, or I thought I believed in many, many years ago as an evolutionist, was that life originated spontaneously. That was, part and parcel of what supposedly was true or was going to be true. I realized it hadn't happened, but I had come to believe that it was about to happen. And, of course, you have to have the spontaneous generation of life in order for evolution to proceed. Well, it's very interesting. At the Arkansas creation trial, the gentleman, the scientist who was there giving the evolutionary position for the origin of life, was cross-examined very, very carefully on that point. And indeed, if you're inclined to read it, you can see that after initially being quite positive about the possibilities, under cross-examination, he began to draw back. In fact, you'll see at one point when one of the lawyers for the state was becoming very, very close and penetrating very, very close to uncovering, so to speak, the truth, and the truth being that scientists today do not have and have not ever been successful in the artificial production of life from inert matter. And yet, in the scientific literature today, and yet throughout America and throughout the world, there are numerous scientists who are today receiving very large sums of government money to work on the artificial synthesis of life in the laboratory. At the Arkansas trial, I made the following statement, that indeed, if life were ever successfully synthesized from inert matter, I would consider this, be a prime example of a fulfillment of an evolutionary prediction, and I would again become an evolutionist. I said it that night, I said it at the trial, and I'll say it again tonight. I do not believe that life will ever be synthesized artificially. It's a lost cause. The only way that will be contradicted, of course, is for someone to do it. At the trial also, my work came under review. The ACLU witness for geology testified for a several billion-year age of the Earth and indicated that the decay rate or the transformation rate had always been constant. He was then cross-examined at length about the way in which he viewed that assumption and finally admitted that it was indeed an assumption. And then my work came into focus through cross-examination, and in the context of that, he was asked about the falsification test. And there's a great deal of his testimony. In fact, all of his testimony as it relates to the falsification test is here in the book. He indicated that as far as he was concerned, the falsification test was meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. Well, I was a little bit surprised. I had proposed something that evolutionists could use to verify that the fundamental premise of their theory was correct. And yet, when it came under focus, or I should say under fire, the testimony was that the test was meaningless. I couldn't quite understand how that could be. If indeed it's something that will enable us in the here and now to decide whether these rocks are really created rocks, and whether they're rocks like this all of the earth, the basement rocks are really rocks that were created instead of evolved,